It all started with something so small and harmless. It was almost laughable. A simple basketball hoop mounted on the edge of my driveway. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't broken down, and it certainly wasn't hurting anyone. To me, it was just a way to unwind after work, a chance to shoot hoops with friends, or let the neighborhood kids practice in the evenings. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to see in any suburban neighborhood. Family-oriented, welcoming, and safe. But in every neighborhood, there's always someone who seems to thrive on controlling the peace of others. And in mine, that person was Karen. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was a self-proclaimed enforcer of neighborhood standards. The kind of person who carried a clipboard instead of a smile, always ready to snap a picture of anything she thought looked out of place. To her, my basketball hoop was the ultimate eyesore. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter. Not a friendly knock at the door, not a neighborly conversation, but an official, typed-out letter slipped into my mailbox. It was a complaint filed through the homeowners association, declaring that my basketball hoop was detracting from the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Those were her words, not mine. At first, I laughed. It seemed ridiculous that anyone would waste their time trying to get rid of a driveway hoop. But that laughter turned into frustration as the letters kept coming. Each one was increasingly stern, demanding that I take it down or face fines. Karen had made it her mission to turn something innocent into a full-blown battle. The irony was almost too much. While she claimed my hoop was lowering property values, her own yard was filled with plastic lawn ornaments, mismatched garden gnomes, and a faded pink flamingo that looked like it had been sunburned a decade ago. But hypocrisy was her specialty. She wasn't concerned about neighborhood beauty. She was concerned about control. The situation escalated quickly. Soon, she wasn't just filing complaints with the HOA. She was standing at the end of her driveway, arms crossed, glaring every time I bounced a ball. She called out to me from across the street about noise whenever I dribbled late in the afternoon. She even stopped kids from playing when I wasn't around, telling them the hoop was unauthorized equipment. It was the kind of relentless negativity that could make anyone cave. But instead of discouraging me, it lit a fire. I realized Karen wasn't just targeting my hoop. She was targeting the idea of fun, of community, of people enjoying themselves. And that made me determined not just to keep my hoop, but to turn her petty complaints into the very reason the neighborhood would change for the better. The turning point came one Saturday morning. A few friends had come over for a casual game. We weren't loud, we weren't disturbing anyone, just shooting around. But as we laughed and played, Karen stormed out of her house, phone in hand, and stood in the middle of the street as if she was gathering evidence. Her exaggerated eye rolls and furious pacing made it clear she was documenting every bounce of the ball. Later that day, another letter arrived. This one carried a threat. If I didn't remove the hoop within 10 days, the HOA would begin fining me daily. And knowing Karen, she would make sure they followed through. I remember staring at that letter, feeling a mix of anger and resolve. If Karen thought she could bully me into submission, she was wrong. I wasn't going to take down my hoop. In fact, I was going to take things further. Much further. That night, an idea began forming in my mind. What if, instead of fighting to keep a single hoop, I went bigger? What if I built something that couldn't be ignored? Something that would transform her petty complaints into the very foundation of a neighborhood tradition. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I had the space, I had the drive, and most importantly, I had the motivation. Karen wanted a fight over a single basketball hoop. I was about to give her a full-blown basketball revolution. And so, what began as a nuisance complaint over a driveway hoop was about to escalate into a project that would change the entire neighborhood dynamic. A project that would flip the script on Karen's obsession with control and turn her greatest annoyance into her greatest nightmare. Because if she thought one hoop was an eyesore, she hadn't yet seen what a full-sized basketball court could do. As I folded up the letter and set it aside, I knew there was no turning back. Karen had started this war, but I was going to finish it, and I was going to finish it in a way that would leave her fuming every time she looked out her window. The next day, I began sketching out the plan, running calculations, and making calls. What had started as a simple driveway hoop was about to evolve into something that would shake the neighborhood to its core. And as the sun set that evening, I couldn't help but smile. Karen had just created her own worst nightmare. When Karen thought she had won by threatening fines, she couldn't have imagined what I was planning in silence. To her, I was just a neighbor with a basketball hoop, cornered into submission. But behind the walls of my house, a different story was unfolding. The idea of building a full-size court was no longer just a fantasy. It became a mission, one that grew clearer with every passing day. I started small, researching the exact dimensions of an official basketball court. 94 feet by 50 feet. Those were the numbers that burned themselves into my brain. A regulation court in the middle of suburbia? It was audacious, it was over the top, and it was exactly what I needed to send a message. My backyard wasn't big enough for the full setup, but my property line extended farther than Karen ever noticed. Most people in the neighborhood used the extra space as lawn or left it untouched. But for me, it was about to become the perfect battleground. I measured, I marked, and I envisioned. Soon, a plain patch of grass would be transformed into the very thing she despised most. The first step was laying down the groundwork. Concrete would need to be poured, lines painted, and hoops installed. But more than that, I wanted the court to feel alive. Bright floodlights for evening games, a sturdy fence around it to keep the ball in play, even seating on the sidelines. If I was going to do this, I wasn't going halfway. Of course, I knew Karen would find out before long. She had a talent for sniffing out anything that went against her vision of a picture-perfect neighborhood. So while I researched building permits and construction requirements, I kept things quiet. I hired a local contractor who understood the game, not just basketball, but the game of dealing with HOAs. Together, we mapped out a schedule that would minimize Karen's ability to interfere. Still, secrecy in a neighborhood like mine was nearly impossible. The first delivery truck gave it away. A massive flatbed carrying rebar and wood for framing rumbled down the street one morning, and before the driver even had time to unload, Karen was already outside, phone in hand, pacing furiously. Her suspicion grew by the hour. She hovered near the property line, squinting at the workers, whispering to passing neighbors, scribbling notes on her infamous clipboard. By the time the first forms for the concrete were set up, she had already fired off a barrage of emails to the HOA board. But this was where her control hit its limit. I had done my homework. The space was part of my property, zoning restrictions were minimal, and as long as I followed local codes, there was nothing she could do. For every complaint she filed, I had paperwork ready to prove her wrong. For every accusation she hurled, I had a permit stamped and signed. That didn't stop her from trying. One afternoon, as workers prepared to pour the first section of concrete, a city inspector pulled up. Karen had filed a report claiming I was violating neighborhood safety standards. But after reviewing my permits, the inspector simply shook his head, gave me a thumbs up, and left, leaving Karen fuming on the sidewalk. The look on her face was priceless. It was the first sign that her grip on control was slipping. But for me, it was just the beginning. As the days passed, the skeleton of the court began to take shape. Wooden frames outlined the massive rectangle that stretched across my backyard. Trucks came and went, filling the air with the smell of fresh concrete. The sound of hammers, drills, and cement mixers echoed across the street. For most of the neighbors, it was just construction noise, nothing unusual. But for Karen, it was torture. Every nail driven, every wheelbarrow poured, was another reminder that her campaign against a simple basketball hoop had spiraled into something she could no longer stop. What surprised me most was how curious the rest of the neighborhood became. People stopped by to ask what I was building. At first, I kept it vague, saying it was just a little backyard project. But word spread quickly. And soon the whispers turned into excitement. A full basketball court? In this neighborhood? Kids lit up at the idea. Parents smiled at the thought of a safe place for their teens to play. And even some of the adults started dreaming about pickup games on weekends. The tide was turning. Karen may have planted the seed of conflict, but I was cultivating a community. What she intended as a personal attack was slowly morphing into something bigger, something that would benefit everyone but her. By the time the concrete was poured and smoothed into place, Karen was at her breaking point. She stormed out one afternoon, circling the construction zone like a hawk, muttering loudly about eyesores and ruining the neighborhood. Her protests fell on deaf ears. The workers ignored her. The inspector had already approved the job, and the neighbors she tried to recruit to her side, many of them smiled at me instead, offering nods of quiet support. The moment the final slab dried, I knew I had crossed a line of no return. This wasn't just about a hoop anymore. This was about principle. Karen wanted to dictate how I lived on my own property. Now, she would have to watch as her least favorite thing, basketball, took root right next door in the biggest, boldest way possible. At night, I would step into the backyard, stand on the smooth concrete surface, and imagine what was to come. Painted lines, shining lights, the sound of sneakers squeaking and balls bouncing, the laughter of kids, the cheers of friends, the thrill of competition filling the air. It was all so close I could almost hear it. And I knew, deep down, that Karen could hear it too, even in her imagination. To her, the nightmare was only beginning. The day the hoops arrived was the day everything changed. Two massive, professional-grade backboards stood tall at either end of the court, their glass gleaming in the sunlight. Workers bolted them firmly into place, their height and presence impossible to ignore. When Karen looked out her window now, she no longer saw a single eyesore. She saw the rise of something that symbolized everything she had tried to stop and failed. But the best part hadn't even started yet. The paint hadn't been laid, the lights weren't installed, and the first game hadn't tipped off. The true revenge wasn't just in building the court, it would be in what happened after. Because the real victory wasn't just construction, it was community. And soon, Karen would discover that she hadn't just lost a battle over a basketball hoop. She had lost the entire neighborhood. The foundation was set. The concrete had hardened, smooth and solid, a blank canvas waiting for transformation. From above, it already looked massive compared to any backyard in the neighborhood. But I knew the best was yet to come. The outlines of a true basketball court were about to be drawn, turning what Karen saw as a simple construction project into her ultimate nightmare. The first step was painting. Early one Saturday morning, a crew arrived with buckets of bright white paint and heavy rollers. They measured every inch carefully, snapping chalk lines to mark the key, the three-point arc, and the free throw lines. Neighbors wandered over, curious, whispering among themselves as the familiar geometry of a court began to appear. Children pressed against the fence, wide-eyed, as the iconic arcs and rectangles took shape. Parents watched too, some smiling, some shaking their heads in disbelief. It wasn't every day someone built a regulation-sized basketball court in a suburban neighborhood. For the kids, it looked like a dream come true. For Karen, it looked like the end of her carefully curated version of suburbia. By the time the last line was painted, the court looked like something pulled straight from a school gym. Only it was outdoors, and it belonged to me. The surface gleamed under the sun, ready for play. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Next came the lights. Towering poles were erected at each corner, fitted with bright LED floodlights designed to make the court playable well into the evening. When the electricians finished wiring and tested the system, the beams lit up the night like a stadium. The glow stretched across lawns, illuminating the neighborhood in an unmistakable way. From her porch, Karen stood frozen, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she might crack. The light washed over her house, impossible to ignore. To her, it wasn't just a glare, It was a spotlight on her defeat. But I wasn't aiming to antagonize her alone. I wanted to create something lasting, something that turned her endless complaints into a legacy of joy. I ordered sturdy metal benches for the sidelines, giving parents and friends a place to sit. I added a scoreboard to one end, not electronic, but big enough to track points for real games. This wasn't just a private court anymore. It was a community gathering spot, taking shape piece by piece. The neighbors noticed. Slowly, the shift became visible. People who once waved politely from a distance now lingered longer near the fence. Kids asked shyly if they could shoot around once it was ready. Parents, once hesitant, began to imagine evenings spent watching their children play safely just down the street. And with every show of support, Karen grew louder. She called emergency meetings with the HOA board, demanding immediate action. She shouted across the street about ruined property values and invasion of privacy. She went door to door, clipboard in hand, pleading with neighbors to sign a petition against me. But instead of gaining traction, she found resistance. Because here's the truth. When you try to take something away from people and someone else offers it back in abundance, people don't side with the complainer. They side with the builder. And now, the neighborhood saw me not as a rule breaker, but as the one who had given them something new, something special. The day the first ball bounced on the fresh concrete was the day the tide fully turned. It wasn't even me. It was a group of kids, their laughter echoing as they dribbled and shot for the very first time. Their joy filled the air, drowning out Karen's constant noise. For every frown she wore, 10 smiles appeared across the court. That evening, when I flicked on the floodlights and the court glowed like a beacon, neighbors gathered without invitation. Some brought lawn chairs, others brought coolers, and before long, it felt like an event. A simple pickup game began, shoes squeaking on the concrete, the ball bouncing rhythmically, cheers erupting as shots swished through the nets. Karen watched from her porch, seething. She yelled about disturbances and trespassing. But the more she shouted, the less anyone listened. Her voice was drowned out by the sounds of a neighborhood finally coming alive. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. For Karen, the nightmare wasn't just about the court existing. It was about the court thriving. And as the games grew, so did her desperation. She filed noise complaints with the city, but inspections found nothing wrong. She threatened lawsuits, but the HOA didn't back her. Every attempt she made to crush the court only made her look smaller, weaker, more desperate. The breaking point came one night, about a week after the court opened. We hosted an impromptu 3-on-3 tournament. The lights blazed, the scoreboard tallied points, and laughter echoed well past sundown. From across the street, Karen emerged once again, shouting, pacing, waving her arms like a storm desperate to be noticed. But nobody looked her way. Nobody cared. For the first time in years, the neighborhood's attention wasn't on her complaints. It was on something positive, something bigger than her control. That night, I realized I had achieved more than revenge. I had built a sanctuary, a place where people could gather, play, and connect. A place that no letter, no clipboard, and no HOA fine could ever erase. But for Karen, the war was far from over. If anything, this was just the start of her full meltdown. And while I was enjoying the cheers of my neighbors, I knew the storm was brewing. She wasn't going to stop, not until she tried every weapon in her arsenal. The question was, how far would she go? If Karen had been angry before, now she was unhinged. The basketball court wasn't just an annoyance anymore. It was an obsession. Every day, she found a new way to lash out, as though the court itself was a personal insult etched into her life. Her first line of attack was noise. She filed daily complaints to the city, claiming the sounds of bouncing balls and cheering crowds were constant disturbances. Inspectors came, clipboards in hand, only to find children playing during normal hours, teenagers shooting hoops in the evening, and adults gathering in friendly matches on weekends. Each time, the city shrugged, noting nothing was excessive. Each time, Karen's face twisted with defeat. Next, she tried parking complaints. On tournament nights, when neighbors filled the street with cars, Karen snapped pictures of every vehicle, circling license plates, forwarding them to the HOA with long rants about traffic congestion. But when the HOA checked, the cars were legally parked, the driveways unobstructed. Once again, Karen's evidence amounted to nothing more than paranoia. Still, she refused to back down. She ramped up her campaign, storming into HOA board meetings with binders stuffed full of photos, letters, and accusations. She waved her arms wildly, pointing at printouts of my court, demanding emergency action. Her voice carried through the meeting hall, shrill and desperate, insisting the court was destroying the neighborhood. But something had shifted. The board members, once deferential to her constant stream of complaints, no longer leaned forward with concern. Instead, they leaned back, weary and skeptical. Because behind Karen's outbursts came a wave of support for me. Parents spoke up about how the court gave their kids a safe place to play. Residents mentioned how gatherings at the court had fostered a sense of community. Even older neighbors, who never touched a basketball, commented on the joy and life it brought to the block. For every accusation Karen hurled, 10 counterpoints rose against her. The HOA, trapped between her demands and the neighborhood's enthusiasm, began to hesitate. For the first time, Karen's iron grip on the board was slipping. But Karen wasn't about to lose quietly. If she couldn't control the HOA, she would escalate beyond them. One morning, a thick envelope arrived at my doorstep. Inside was a formal letter from a lawyer, Karen's lawyer. She was threatening a lawsuit, claiming my court was a public nuisance and a safety hazard. She wanted it removed, permanently, and she was willing to drag me to court to make it happen. The letter might have rattled some people, but to me, it was just another bluff. My permits were airtight. My property line was clear. Everything had been done by the book. If Karen wanted a legal fight, she was going to lose, and lose badly. Still, she pressed on. She called the police one evening, standing dramatically in the street while officers arrived to check on the disturbance. They found nothing more than a friendly game under the floodlights, neighbors laughing and cheering. The officers stayed for a while, chatted with the players, even took a couple of shots at the hoop themselves before leaving with a smile. Karen, red-faced and sputtering, stomped back to her house as the game carried on. Each failed attempt only fueled her desperation. She printed flyers claiming my court was dangerous, slipping them into mailboxes. She stood at the edge of her driveway with her clipboard, glaring at anyone who entered my yard. She shouted warnings to parents, insisting the court was unsafe, even as kids sprinted past her to play. But the more she fought, the more isolated she became. Neighbors who once tolerated her antics began avoiding her altogether. Her constant rants fell on deaf ears. Her flyers went straight to the trash, and her reputation crumbled under the weight of her own obsession. Meanwhile, the court thrived. What began as casual pickup games grew into organized tournaments. Families brought food and drinks, setting up tailgate-style gatherings on weekends. People who had lived in the neighborhood for years but never spoken before now shared laughter, high fives, and friendly rivalries. The court wasn't just a slab of concrete anymore. It was the heartbeat of the community. And every beat of that heart drove Karen further into madness. The breaking point came during the neighborhood's first full tournament. I had organized it quietly, spreading the word among supportive neighbors. 8 teams signed up, ranging from teenagers to middle-aged dads reliving their glory days. Brackets were made, a small trophy was bought, and the entire block buzzed with excitement. When the day arrived, the court was alive with energy. Cars lined the street, folding chairs circled the sidelines, and the smell of grilled food filled the air. Cheers erupted with every shot, laughter echoed between games, and for once, the neighborhood felt united in something bigger than itself. And then there was Karen. She emerged from her house like a storm, camera in hand, screaming over the noise. She marched up and down the street, filming license plates, shrieking about illegal gatherings, demanding the game stop immediately. But her voice was drowned out by the crowd. Nobody listened. Nobody cared. Her face twisted in disbelief as she realized the truth. She wasn't feared anymore. She wasn't respected. She wasn't even heard. The neighborhood she once controlled had moved on without her, finding joy in the very thing she had tried to destroy. And as I stood on the sidelines, watching neighbors cheer each other on, I knew the war had reached a turning point. Karen had thrown everything at me: complaints, fines, lawsuits, even the police, and none of it had worked. But the battle wasn't over yet, because Karen wasn't the type to surrender. If anything, her failure today would only drive her to escalate further. And the question wasn't whether she'd try again. It was how far she'd be willing to go to reclaim the control she had already lost. Karen had been embarrassed, ignored, and overruled, but humiliation only hardened her resolve. Losing control of the neighborhood was unthinkable to her. If the HOA wouldn't listen, the police wouldn't stop us, and the courts couldn't touch me, then she would take matters into her own hands. The change was subtle at first. One morning, I walked outside to find trash scattered across the court: fast food wrappers, plastic bottles, even a bag of rotting leftovers. At first, I assumed it was random litter, but after the third time in a week, the pattern was clear. Someone was sneaking onto the court at night, making a mess in hopes of driving people away. We cleaned it up each time, laughing it off. The kids even turned it into a game, racing to see who could collect the most trash bags. If Karen thought a little garbage would stop us, she hadn't learned a thing. Then came the sabotage. One Saturday morning, just hours before a scheduled tournament, we discovered deep scratches across the surface of the court. Someone had dragged metal across the concrete, gouging it in long, ugly lines. The marks didn't make the court unusable, but they were deliberate, destructive acts meant to send a message. Neighbors were furious. Some wanted to confront Karen directly, others wanted to call the police, but I insisted we focus on fixing the damage. Within hours, a few dads brought out patch kits and tools, smoothing over the worst of it. By game time, the court was ready again, and the sound of bouncing balls filled the air as if nothing had happened. Karen had failed again, but she wasn't finished. Her most desperate act came late one night. I was asleep when a knock at the door jolted me awake. A neighbor stood on the porch, pale-faced, pointing toward the court. I ran outside and froze. Karen was in the middle of the court, a can of white paint in her hand, smearing it across the surface in erratic lines. She was muttering angrily, her hair disheveled, her face twisted in fury. Under the glow of the floodlights, she looked less like a neighbor and more like someone completely unhinged. Before I could speak, other neighbors poured out of their houses, phones in hand, recording the spectacle. Karen didn't stop. She screamed about property values and ruined neighborhoods, her voice cracking as she painted wild streaks over the court markings. The more she realized people were filming, the louder and more frantic she became, until finally the police arrived. When the officers approached, Karen tried to argue. She insisted she was protecting the community, that the court was illegal, that she was the victim. But the evidence was undeniable. Fresh paint on her hands, cans at her feet, and a crowd of witnesses recording every second. The police escorted her off the property that night. For the first time, Karen wasn't just embarrassing herself. She was facing real consequences. The neighborhood watched in silence as she was led away, her shouts fading into the night. By morning, word had spread. Everyone knew what had happened, and while the court bore the ugly streaks of her vandalism, it also carried something else: proof that Karen had crossed a line she couldn't come back from. The same neighbors who once stayed quiet now spoke openly about her behavior. Some even whispered about voting her out of the HOA board entirely. The court was cleaned again, patched and repainted with the help of volunteers. And when the next tournament rolled around, the games continued stronger than ever. What Karen had tried to destroy had only grown more resilient. But Karen wasn't finished, not yet. Even after the humiliation, the police report, and the whispers of removal from the HOA board, she still believed she could win. She filed more paperwork, appealed to county officials, and even hinted at filing a civil suit. But the truth was clear. Her influence was crumbling. Every desperate move only made her look weaker, angrier, and more irrational. The neighborhood no longer saw her as a leader. She was a spectacle, a cautionary tale of what happens when control turns into obsession. And as the court thrived, Karen's world began to shrink. The end game was coming, and it wouldn't be decided by Karen's rage or my defiance. It would be decided by the community, the very people she had alienated in her war to destroy me. Because now, the neighborhood wasn't just defending me or the court. They were defending themselves. And Karen was about to learn what it really meant to lose everything. The days following Karen's late-night meltdown were unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. For years, people had tolerated her behavior, rolling their eyes at her constant complaints, grumbling under their breath when she enforced ridiculous HOA rules. But now, after vandalism, police intervention, and public humiliation, tolerance had turned into action. Whispers spread quickly. The same neighbors who once avoided confrontation were now united with a clear goal. It was time to end Karen's reign. The HOA board, once her stage for grandstanding, became her battlefield. At the next meeting, dozens of residents showed up, far more than usual. The air was charged with anticipation, every chair filled, every wall lined with people who had grown tired of her tyranny. Karen arrived with her usual stack of papers and binder full of grievances. But this time, the energy in the room was different. She wasn't greeted with nods or polite silence. She was greeted with crossed arms, shaking heads, and eyes that no longer saw her as an authority, but as the problem. When the meeting began, Karen launched into her routine. She ranted about the basketball court, waved photos of cars parked on the street, and screamed about neighborhood decay. But the audience didn't sit quietly this time. They pushed back. One parent stood and spoke about how the court gave their kids a safe place to play. Another mentioned how neighbors who had never spoken before were now closer because of the weekend tournaments. A retiree raised his voice, saying the laughter and life the court brought was worth far more than the silence of fear Karen had ruled with for years. Each voice chipped away at her authority, each statement unraveling the image she had clung to for so long. Finally, a motion was called, something whispered about for weeks, but never dared spoken aloud until now. A vote of no confidence. The HOA board would decide if Karen should be removed as president. The vote was swift. One by one, hands went up, nearly unanimous. Only Karen herself opposed. The gavel fell, and in a single moment, the power she had lorded over the neighborhood for years evaporated. Karen sat frozen, her face pale, her papers trembling in her hands. She tried to argue, to scream about illegality and bias, but her words fell flat. The room no longer belonged to her. The meeting ended, and Karen stormed out, shoulders stiff, eyes wild. It would be one of the last times she appeared at a community event. Slowly, she withdrew from the spotlight she had once craved. The neighborhood she tried to control had rejected her completely. Meanwhile, the basketball court thrived like never before. With Karen's influence gone, tournaments grew bigger, more organized. Families brought lawn chairs and coolers, vendors set up food stands, and the court became a centerpiece of the community. The once silent street now buzzed with laughter, cheers, and the unmistakable thump of a bouncing ball. It wasn't just a court anymore, it was a symbol, a reminder that the neighborhood didn't belong to one person with a clipboard and a temper. It belonged to the people who lived there, who built friendships on the pavement and created memories under the glow of the floodlights. As for Karen, her house grew quiet. Curtains always drawn, yard unkempt, her once constant presence with clipboard in hand vanished. She became a shadow, a warning of what happens when power and obsession consume someone. The neighbors who once feared her now pitied her. She had lost everything: her position, her respect, her voice. And me? I stood at the edge of the court one warm evening, watching kids play while parents chatted on the sidelines. I thought back to the beginning, to a simple basketball hoop in my driveway, to Karen's first complaint about it being an eyesore. She had wanted to take away something small. Instead, she had pushed me to build something bigger than I ever imagined. Her crusade had backfired. What she saw as her victory was, in the end, her downfall. And the very court she despised had become the legacy of her failure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lights flickered on, and the game carried into the night. The sound of bouncing basketballs echoed through the neighborhood, not as noise, but as music, the rhythm of freedom, the anthem of community. And every single bounce was a reminder of one undeniable truth: Karen had lost. The neighborhood had won. The final whistle had blown, and the game would never end.